Welcome back.
Ma'am, I shall go live in a minute and then I will be mute for a minute before, to wait, let the participant in. We are live, ma'am, now.
Can you hear me, Prashant?
Certainly, ma'am, certainly.
Prashant, should I start?
Just 1 minute, ma'am. A very good afternoon to all of you and warm welcome to today's webinar entitled RT-PCR-based detection of SARS-CoV-2, Understanding the Technique and Navigating Challenges. The COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in severe disruption, and test, trace, and test is the best possible solution we have until an effective treatment regime or a protective vaccine is available. RT-PCR is the gold standard under the testing vertical of COVID-19 management. And today's webinar focuses on important considerations during RT-PCR testing and address challenges. Today we have Dr. Camila Rodriguez, who is here to educate us on the key considerations in RT-PCR testing and how to address challenging points. Dr. Camila is one of the most renowned microbiologists in the country. She is the consultant microbiologist and chair infection control at Hinduja Hospital, Mumbai. She is the member of multiple internationals and national boards and committees. She has over 300 publications and mentored around 100 projects in collaboration with even NIH Oxford Wellcome Trust. I'm sure it's going to be a great learning experience for all of us, and I request Dr. Camila to kindly start the session. Thank you. Dr. Camila?
Yeah.
Please.
Thank you, Prashant. Can you hear me?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, friends. The mandate today that has been given to me by FIND is actually talking about the RT-PCR, but I'm going to include the last few slides on antibodies because I think that's everybody's worry as well. So the last 4-5 slides will be on antibody detection as well. So given the scale of the SARS-CoV challenge, this defining global crisis has warranted decisive and visionary strategies. And believe me that it's been a chance to turn crisis into opportunity. Imagine by Jan 18th, Charité in Berlin actually had a fully validated RT-PCR up and running for the whole world to start and follow. That is really the advancement of science today. And this is our world today. This is data pulled off the dashboard of Johns Hopkins. We are 45 million strong and our country has more than 8 million. So what is unique about SARS? You all know it's the 7th human infected coronavirus identified today. And it's a single stranded positive RNA virus that belongs to the beta coronavirus lineage B. What makes this virus absolutely unique to its cousins before is that it has unprecedented transmission. It is easily and efficiently transmitted. The virus shedding is highest within 2 days of symptoms, and asymptomatics and even pre-symptomatics transmit. So that's the challenge in this. And I like this slide by Pogo because he says, we have met the enemy and he is us. It's your best friend. It could be your daughter, your son, your closest colleague who could be transmitting infection to you and not knowing it. So basically, it's all about the timing. And this sort of talks about the 3 escalating phases. All of us have seen this slide. This is classification of COVID-19 disease states and the therapeutic targets. And we have early infection, pulmonary phase, and the hyperinflammation phase. And the treatments we're not going into today. But estimated variation over time in diagnostic tests is really relative to symptom onset. So you see here, if you can see here, you have the blue line, which is the nasopharyngeal PCR swab that comes up here. It's maximum positive within when the patient presents with the symptoms. And it stays positive for about the first, second week, really high, and then starts tapering off. And so on and so forth with each of the samples. If you look at the pink line, that's the bronchoalveolar lavage. That's a really good sample, but it's actually not advised because it generates a lot of aerosols, and no pulmonologist is happy to do a bronchoscopy to give us a sample. Okay, now I'm doing this in a little bit more detail subsequently, but as you can see here, the specimen collection guidelines are by CDC and WHO. Nasopharyngeal swab is a swab to do. If it's unavailable, then you do oropharyngeal or a nasal mid-turbinate nasal swab or an aspirate, a nasopharyngeal wash. For the lower respiratory tract, you would prefer to do a sputum, bronchoalveolar lavage, which as we said is difficult to get. For upper respiratory tract, as we said earlier, it's nasopharyngeal. What you need to be cognizant of is that you actually need a flocked synthetic swab on a nylon handle that is preferred, and you cannot use or should not use calcium alginate or cotton with wooden shafts because they actually inhibit the RNA. So when you look at specimen collection, you actually do it this way. You put it, you tilt the patient's head and you put the narrow thin swab right to the back of the nose. You traverse it. So when it's tilted, it will not go up. It will go through the nose and hit the nasopharyngeal area here. And you move it till there's no resistance. It's actually quite a long distance, about 3 to 4 centimeters. And you know you've done a good job. When you've reached there, you've turned the swab 2-3 times and waited 10 seconds for the swab to absorb all the material that you've made possible by turning the swab. And you know it's successful when the patient actually, a tear comes down. Similarly, when you're doing an oropharyngeal swab, you actually touch the posterior pharyngeal wall and it should elicit a gag. Now, this is the SARS-CoV testing positivity rates. As you can see here, BAL is the best sample. Sputum is also 72% in later stages, and nasopharyngeal 63-32 PCs. And blood and urine are actually really bad samples because it's not much of viremia, as you see. It's mainly in the respiratory tract. This slide actually is a slide that Dr. Anjali and I were going through this morning. And we found our entire mandate of wanting nasopharyngeal swabs is actually this 63. This is the same study that I showed earlier. This one is based on just 8 swabs, 8 nasal swabs, which gave a 63% positive result when compared to the others. They didn't even compare it to culture. But when they did 101,000 over 1,000 specimens from 205 patients, they came to the conclusion that actually the nasopharyngeal swabs are possibly the best here, followed by the pharyngeal swabs. We are doing both. We currently collect both in nasopharyngeal and oropharyngeal, and we put it into the same vial at the start of the symptoms. This was another study, again, that talks of using detection as any titer as the standard. Note they've not used viral culture as the standard. The sensitivities were 90, 80, and 87 for NP, nasal, and throat respectively. The numbers were small, so again, interpret with caution. But still, the bottom line is nasopharyngeal is preferred. Now, current methods, as you know, have multiple challenges. The sensitivity is low, is just about 70%. You need specialized swabs, as we spoke of. You need VTM. VTM sometimes goes off. The color changes. You really need good VTM. Most important, it's a risk to our healthcare workers. And the patient really is uncomfortable because he hates doing a swab. So saliva is what people are looking at today. It's minimally invasive. It's self-administered. And actually, you have now salivary collection cups where the patient just does a little gargle and spits it out. And apparently with comparable sensitivity. We haven't yet started using saliva, but we will shortly. And these are the various kits that can be used for saliva. Now, the WHO has asked that when you collect it, how do you transport it to the lab? It must be at 4 degrees, so it must be on ice. And you store, if it is less than 5 days, at 4 degrees, and more than 5 days, you put it at -70. So initially, when you get your samples, you've got to aliquot them quickly What we do is when we receive our samples, we allocate it immediately and keep 2 for the testing, and we keep the other 3. Sorry, we keep the other 3 at -70 in case we have to go back to it. Now, as you can see, there's one thing you need to know from here. The ones that are with a star are the ones where you needn't put them in VTM. So you have bronchoalveolar lavage. With a star, you need VTM, sorry. But sputum and tissue from the lung, you don't have to put VTM. You can give them straight to us. And these are the requirements for specimen collection, packaging, and transport. These are from our Indian guidelines. And basically, to put it simply, you have to pack it with absorbent material. You have to have a leak-proof the primary containers, leak-proof secondary container, label adequately, hard frozen gel packs, and pack it in a vaccine hardboard box and send it. Now, before I actually get into PCR, I'm going to talk to you about something very basic. This is not about SARS-CoV. This is just about how accurate is a diagnostic test. Any test, whether it is a culture, whether it is any diagnostic test. Sensitivity refers to the ability of a test to detect minute quantities of antigen. Basically, it's positivity in disease. That means a sensitive test, test that is very sensitive, may give false positives. And specificity refers to the ability of a test to detect only homologous antibodies. So it's negativity in health. Now, all of you know about this, excuse me. All of you know about the diagnostic, the sensitivity and specificity. So let's look at a test. We're not talking about SARS, we're looking at any test. We have TP over, this is the formula, TP over TP plus FN. So if you have a test that disease positive and test positive gives 9, you have a sensitivity, I'm just giving you an example, sensitivity of 90% and a specificity also of 90%, okay? Now I'm trying to put into perspective why it is important. Just so you have a test that has a sensitivity and specificity of 90%. So the seller or the manufacturer will say, look, this is a wonderful test. It's got a sensitivity and specificity of 90%. But very important is you need to know the pre-test prevalence. So for example, even if we look at SARS, what is the pre-test prevalence in the population you're going to test that you need to know? For example, the same test with a pre-test prevalence of 10%, when you do a PPV, will have a 50% positive predictive value. If you go to a pre-test prevalence of 50%, the same test gives you a positive predictive value of 90%. So basically, we need to keep these points in perspective whenever we do a test. We shouldn't do a test on somebody who really, is not warranting it. The patient has to be clinically relevant. The pre-test prevalence must be good. Okay. And COVID-19 actually highlights the differences between analytical sensitivity and clinical sensitivity. Analytical sensitivity is the ability to detect the pathogen in the specimen, and clinical sensitivity is the ability to detect the infected status of the patient. And this is what we're talking about all the time. It depends on the sampling site, the method of collection, the duration of symptoms, and the disease severity. And this is a simple cartoon that just talks about the virus, the most infectious, this is the virus, and we're just talking about that. So how do we detect the virus? We have molecular methods and we have antigen. Now, when you look at molecular methods, they're always done from the site where the virus is likely to be most, which is the respiratory tract. As I said earlier, you cannot look for molecular methods from the blood or even the urine. So you need the respiratory tract. So the real-time RT-PCR has really good high sensitivity and specificity, but it needs complex molecular setups and it's labor intensive. Today, the nucleic acid amplification tests have surpassed viral culture as gold standard. And as a microbiologist, I have to say that, molecular biology has really achieved here. It has much wider application, it has higher sensitivity, it has rapid performance and ability for field deployment. And happy to say that in India, today we've really ramped up across our country with ICMR support, ensuring NABL accreditation, with giving quality results across our country really well. And the SARS-CoV virus, as you see, you have the ORF, basically the genome codes for a polyprotein, that is an ORF1ab, which is involved in replication and transcription of the viral RNA, and 4 structural proteins. N, S, E, and M. And these are the targets. Now look at the slide. It actually talks about the ORF1A and the ORF1B, the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase that Karite chose. They actually chose this particular gene, the RDRP, and they chose the E gene, the envelope gene. The envelope gene is kind of a not so specific, and this is the confirmatory one. But the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase is actually part of the ORF1B. And this slide is really nice because it puts into perspective what you're looking at in various tests. And what are those various tests that you can kind of, Europe believes in the WHO Berlin Karite protocol, which is the E envelope gene and the RDRP. The US actually goes for all the nucleocapsid targets, and China goes for ORF1AB plus the nucleocapsid. But the ideal design, you have to have one conserved region and one specific region. Now, this just puts into perspective the limit of detection. We're coming back to this, and I'm not going to tread on this area because Kanchan and Sapna will talk about it, but the limit of detection for real-time RT-PCR is less than 10 copies per mil. For expert, it is 250, and for TrueNAT, it is 486. Now, what about the rapid tests? These are the rapid RT-PCRs are easy to use, really fast. You have two types. One is an RT-PCR near point of care, into which would be the expert, the MolBio, our very own Indian MolBio, and BioFire, which I haven't used, but I believe was withdrawn. Then there's the isothermal tests, where Abbott ID Now and LAMP are included. So this is the molecular test. This is the GeneXpert Express, which is a self-enclosed system integrating extraction, amplification, and detection. Results are available in 45 minutes. This is the TrueNAT, screening E gene and confirmatory gene. I believe it's now on both genes are on a chip. And the screening, it takes about an hour, 40 minutes, I think. The advantages of these, both TrueNAT and Expert, are that one is a chip-based assay, one is a cartridge-based assay. And the advantages are in TrueNAT, it is battery operable, no need of AC, cost-effective. But it is a two-step process as of now. Now it's going to be one. And the limit of detection, as I said, is just under 500. Here, this is the GeneXpert has power operable, possibly needs AC room, and it's a single process, and 250 is the copies per minute. What are the real-time isothermal amplification equipments that we have? Abbott ID Now has just brought this equipment in, and it has a turnaround time in 15 minutes. We've seen it, and it's quite cute, you know. It just sort of really gives you results fast. I believe the CT value stops at 33. So we need to deal with those issues when we get there. This is the second isothermal amplification is LAMP. Again, the turnaround time is 20 minutes. This is the new kid on the block. This is CRISPR, which is being developed in Delhi by CISR. And this is going to be launched in India, I believe, on the 9th of November. It's an easy to do kit. Basically, you have a patient specimen, you extract the RNA, you do a quick PCR, and then you have a simple sort of a lateral flow that reads out the test. So it's a low isothermal state with no need to sort of, and the results basically are available in less than an hour. So the comparison of the major molecular methods, RT-PCR, clinical sensitivity, specificity, total time is much more. It's almost 160 hours sometimes from extraction to PCR. These are the point of care tests, much shorter. CRISPR will be about an hour. And this is, of course, is next-gen sequencing, which takes time. I'm going to now actually illustrate 2 or 3 cases. Do I have time? 1 minute. Oops, I better hurry along. So this is case 1. We have a patient with fever and cough for 3 days who has increasing dyspnea. He became seriously ill, collapsed, and was intubated in the emergency room. The X-ray shows these non-specific abnormalities. The nasopharyngeal swab shows that SARS-CoV-2 is detected. The patient is admitted to ICU. He receives his regular treatment and shows improvement over time. The nasopharyngeal swab at 18 days, remember he's been in ICU, he's been sick, is still detected at 18 days. The patient is now actually sitting up in bed and wants to go home, and his family says, you know what, no, if he's positive, we're not taking him home. One point to remember, and that I'm going to talk about in a bit, is the CT value. The CT is the point of intersection between the amplification curve, here this is the amplification curve, and the fluorescent threshold. Basically, it is a number of replicating cycles required to produce a fluorescent signal, and it's inversely proportional to the viral load. In other words, a lower CT represents a higher viral load. So the burning question is there a correlation between CT value and disease severity? Apparently not. Why? It is a rough estimation of the viral load, but you cannot say. I mean, really, patients who are asymptomatic may have a high viral load and may have a low CT. So what does a high CT mean? A high CT above, when it's about 30, 34, 35, 36 would be a poorly collected swab, very early before the patient is symptomatic, or late stage, or really patients who've gone beyond the viremic stage or the and getting into the cytokine storm stage. So demystifying the cycle threshold, how do CT values go with the viral load? One, specimen collections vary. You have different techniques, different types, storage and transport. The CT values actually vary for a specimen with different kits in this and techniques. For example, target genes differ. There may be E, depending what kit you're using, E, RDRP, the ORF, 1A, 1B, NOS. The primers differ. So you can't really take one kit and say, oh, the CT is so much and this kit is so much. So it doesn't really translate that exactly to the viral load. The baseline threshold fluorescence also differ. In fact, they may vary between different runs of the same kit. They may vary between nasopharyngeal and oropharyngeal swabs on the same day. Most importantly, we're actually not doing known standards to estimate the viral load. So they're not really quantitative. So don't say that the CT is the viral load, as often clinicians will ask us. Now, going back to our case here, the patient asked for the physician asked for the CT. Incidentally, in this case, it was, I think, 36, 37. So we said, don't worry, our cutoff is 37 just now. Wait it in another 2 days, he'll be negative. But he's clearly not infectious. So the important point to note is that when I said that NATs have surpassed viral culture as the gold standard for all these reasons, the drawbacks are that they actually fail to determine virus infectivity. And the specificity for detecting the replicating virus is really poor. In this particular study, they showed the infectivity of patients with a CT value of more than 24 was low. And it actually correlated with a 3% ability to culture the virus when the CT was more than 24. In this study, where they got a CT above 33, 34, they said that they are not contagious because the amount of viral cultures they got was 1%. So theoretically, the other issue is that these tests, when we say the CT above 33, 34 is possibly not contagious, they have been validated for the E gene. What it is for N and what it is for the others is still not well defined. So this shows you the biological assessment of hospitalized patients with COVID-19. And as you can see here, seroconversion and virus isolation. Here, seroconversion is here, and virus isolation is clearly dependent on the day of isolation of symptoms. Live virus isolation is possible in the first week, and usually, there is no isolation after day 8 in spite of ongoing high viral load. Now, having said that, I think we need to remember that the ones who are outliers in this case would be patients who are in the ICU, where we go with a day 15, and patients who are very immune suppressed because they don't have the immunity to possibly fight the virus. And it is, they may continue to shed off and on. So again, how long do infected persons remain infectious? PCR positivity can continue up to 6 weeks. It's 98% in the first week, 89 in the second, 66 in the third, and up to 5% in the fifth week. And the estimated likelihood of recovering replication competent viruses approaches 0 by 10 days, which is why we've made a 10 plus 7. If the patient doesn't have symptoms in the first 10 days, with the last 3 days, he's possibly non-infectious. This slide, this is a really nice article from the NEJM, which is actually telling us how to, this curve you can see here, this one in green is the pre-infectious positive by PCR, small little area. And this is the post-infection positive by PCR. So this is where within this curve, you can see this area is where the patient is actually infectious. This long tail of RNA positivity here and going down here is actually with a really good test Many persons whose infections are detected using tests with high analytical sensitivity may actually not be infectious. And finally, I'm going to actually quickly end because I think I've exceeded my time. This is case 2. This is a patient who had fever with diarrhea for 2 days and the symptoms subsided. 5 days later, he develops cough with slight breathlessness on exertion. His nasopharyngeal swab for SARS-CoV-2 on day 8 was not detected. Meanwhile, because his symptoms were associated with the chest and he was breathless, he did a CT chest, which showed a CORADS 4 or 5. The repeat nasopharyngeal swab was still not detected. This is day 10. Meanwhile, his CRP and D-dimer are both high. And the clinician says, look, this is COV. Why are you not giving me a positive test? And if you look at the timelines of RNA positivity, the temporal development in different sites over time, PCR positivity is different in different samples and declines slowly in sputum and stool. Look at this. This light green is upper respiratory tract. So look how it's declining. We're talking about 10 days into symptoms, right? But look at what could be a good sample, the lower respiratory tract in the second week. So try, and that is what we did actually. And this is just to show you that this is adapted from an ESMID webinar, which shows that the testing modalities perform as per symptoms. Day 0, day 6, day 15, severe, mild, and asymptomatic are here. So here you can see the RNA PCR with high CT. Look at these dotted lines. That's when they start becoming high CT. But again, they're not infectious. And I'm going to skip this slide. I don't have the time. So basically, back in this patient, the sputum was positive in this patient. So you just had to know when the patient was symptomatic, and if you're really suspecting, and give another sample, not from the nasopharyngeal area, but from an area in the second week sputum. Okay, so why false negatives are in RT-PCR? One is inappropriate timing of collection in relation to symptom onset. The viral load kinetics differ in different anatomic sites. How you sample, you have somebody who really doesn't know how to sample and just puts it in the nose and gives it. Depends on the quality of the sample. There may be testing errors and of course reactivation and reinfection. And just to sort of touch on the other way you look at the virus is antigen tests. These are very specific but really poorly sensitive, just about 50%. In the kit that we are using currently, recommended by ICMR, it's about 50% sensitivity, but specificity is good, which means all negative antigen tests must be confirmed with RT-PCR. And this is another article which talks about low performance of the rapid antigen test as frontline tests. And 4 slides on detection of antibody. And I want to make a point here that we're talking antibody tests are available all across in practically every street corner. Everyone is doing it. But you need to know, when you say an antibody, you need to know what antibody are we talking about. There are 2 types of antibodies. One is binding antibodies, which everyone is doing. And the second is neutralizing and blocking antibodies, which actually indicate immunity. So you have the CLIA. There are 2 types of antibody targets. One is they target the nucleocapsid antigen, and one targets the spike-1 receptor binding domain. The CLIA tests are the best. But the sad thing is, in asymptomatic patients, the IgG levels really start declining. And it seems within 2 months, the antibodies, even in symptomatic patients, the IgG nucleocapsid antibodies seem to be declining. So when we say we are positive for antibody, all it means is that we've been exposed. The duration of protection is unknown, and the IgG and IgM that we do cannot differentiate between with the neutralizing antibodies and binding antibodies. This is the antibodies we have to detect. They detect herd immunity. They are the actual immunity passport. The neutralizing antibodies that none of us is doing so far, we propose to start doing it. It's good for therapy validation, and of course, this is going to be the icing on the cake. It's good for vaccine efficacy. And this is what is the new kid on the block. It's a surrogate viral neutralizing test. Surrogate viral that's been developed actually in Singapore and sort of obviates the need to deal with live virus. So friends, this is Dr. Soman's slide, and it actually really nicely tells you how you can differentiate COVID-19 with radiology from non-COVID. So you can do it, even the radiologist can tell you. So the challenges in diagnosis lastly are symptoms sometimes are minimal and non-specific. They do not preclude transmission. Conventional or the real-time RT-PCR is high on sensitivity and specificity, but is skill dependent with a long turnaround time. The rapid RT-PCR is convenient, but expensive and doesn't fit in our ceiling costs. The rapid antigens are specific but non-sensitive. Serology doesn't ensure protection. Neutralizing antibodies are required, the NAbs, and radiology is useful for screening, but is not confirmatory. I'm going to stop here because I think we need to allow the practical aspects of this talk, and my two heroines here, Dr. Kanchan and Dr. Sapna, will be taking this further. And basically, just to sort of wind up saying that COVID has reshaped our world, no question. And as the waves of contagion come and go, till an effective vaccine is found, I think we need to revisit our healthcare delivery, because till then we need to really take the Kavach mantra of for COVID, which is mask up, keep distance, and hand hygiene. I'm giving over to Kanchan now. Come.
Hello, everyone. I'll be talking on the actual aspects of COVID diagnosis, wherein you have all the different kits, everything, and the main objective is accurate COVID diagnosis and rapid COVID diagnosis. So first, coming on to the specimen collection, with the success of any test, or for rather the success of the accurate diagnosis of SARS-CoV, it depends largely on the quality of the specimen and the conditions under which it is transported. So you have the VTM, the viral transport medium, which has the nutritional components and the pH, which make it an ideal medium for transporting the specimen, which is collected in this VTM and sent to the lab for it to be processed immediately. Now, you have, as Dr. Rodrigues has already dealt upon the nasopharyngeal and the oropharyngeal swab collection. The biosafety guidelines is the RNA extraction or the isolation. It should be performed in a biosafety level 2 facility. The various PPE that are required are N95 masks, goggles, body covers, head covers, shoe covers, and these are required for sample handling and RNA isolation. The surgical mask is required for the RT-PCR setup post-extraction. The various extraction methods approved by ICMR are the QIAGEN mini-kit, you have the RNA mini-kit from PureLink, and the various companies that have these various extraction kits. But the isolation of a high-quality RNA is the most crucial step, which is the first initial step for a successful RT-PCR detection. The gold standard is the organic two-phase phenol chloroform method, but that's difficult to automate, and it's a very, in a high throughput settings, it is difficult to automate, and it is very laborious. So there are various extraction methods that are established for this. You have the spin column extraction method, which is a solid phase extraction method wherein the silica filter is used and the samples are lysed. Then it's bound to the silica filter, and this is passed through the membrane using centrifugal force. The automation for this is the QIAcube Connect, which has 12 samples which can run together in one batch, and the runtime in the machine is 55 minutes. You can either perform a manual lysis and then put the samples into the machine, or you can give the command for lysis in the machine itself. The other extraction method is the magnetic particle extraction method. In this method, the cells are lysed in a buffer with the RNase inhibitors, which is then incubated with the magnetic beads, which allows the particles to bind to the RNA molecules. Now, the drawback with this method is only if viscous samples can impede the migration of the magnetic beads. The various automated methods for this using this principle are the Kingfisher Duo Prime, which has 24 samples. You have the bioMérieux Easy Mag. You have the Flex, which has 96 samples in a 20 minutes run. And you have the Kaya Symphony, which has 96 samples, but it takes 50 minutes for one batch of 24 samples. So coming on to the virus, you have the various molecular assays, which is for diagnosis of acute infection, and it's very sensitive and specific. It's rapid, but it needs expensive devices. Now, the RT-PCR, the various targets for detection include the genes that encode the N, E, and the S proteins, the open reading frame ORF1AB and RDRP region. Then you have E gene, which is a highly conserved among all beta coronaviruses. The RDRP gene, which can be used to differentiate the, it's a specific gene for the COVID virus. And the S gene is also very useful for differentiating the COVID from the other coronaviruses. Now, the steps to the PCR is, as this is an RNA virus, you have the RNA which is extracted, then that is converted into cDNA, and followed by the various denaturation and annealing and the elongation of the PCR, wherein you have the probes which are having a fluorescent dye and a quencher. So you have the machine which detects the fluorescent signal and then thereby converting it into the CT. Now, what the kit that we use for the COVID detection is the TACPAC COVID-19 combo kit, which is a multiplex real-time PCR kit for qualitative detection. And the targets are N gene, ORF1 gene, S gene. The limit of detection is 10 genomic copy equivalents. The result interpretation is this is how you have to set the manual threshold, and you have the baseline. So the CT threshold is the intersection between an amplification curve and a threshold line. So these are how the results look in the system. We use the ABI 7500 fast. You can see for this particular sample, it is showing a CT value around 26 for one of the targets and 27 for the other two targets. Similarly, this sample, it shows a CT value of 31 for all the three targets, ultimately having a positive result. So I will now request Swapna to take over.
Good evening all. Now I am going to give a brief explanation about the rapid test detection for COVID-19 by the three different methods: expert, express. Detection of COVID is by two targets: it's E genes and N2 genes. It's a closed system which minimizes the contamination. Easy to operate and no expertise is required. Speak louder. Speak louder. Okay. Good evening all. Good evening all. I'm going to give a brief explanation about the rapid test detection for the COVID-19 by the three different methods: expert, express. One is expert express. Detection of COVID is by the two targets: E genes and N2 genes. It's a closed system which minimizes the contaminations. Easy of operations and no expertise required. No expertise required. It's a very simple procedure. Take the expert cartridge, mix the tritium, open the cartridge, add 300 microliter of the sample volume into the cartridge, close the cartridge and load it into the machine. Within a 50 minutes, you will come to know the status of the samples, whether it is negative or it is positive. In case of the negative, the SPC has to be amplified. And in case of the positive, there are two targets that get amplified. Either one of them get amplified or both together get amplified. Second method is for detection of COVID-19 is by the TrueNAT method. The semi-quantitative detections of beta coronavirus RNA in human oropharyngeals and nasopharyngeal swab. The targets are the E genes for the screening and RDRP for the confirmations on the two different separate chips. Positive E genes should be confirmed by RDRP chips, and all genes negatives are to be considered as true negative. It's a simple procedure. The extraction is done by TruePrep auto extractor. It takes the 25 minutes to be performed, and the amplification is done in the either in the DO or in the Quattro or in the UNO-DX. At the end of the 45 minutes, you will come to know the status of the samples, whether it is detected or it is not detected. In the case of the detected, it gives the load of the samples, whether it is high, medium, low, or very low. The third method is by Abbott ID Now. Abbott ID Now COVID-19 is a rapid test, deliver the high quality molecular positive results in as little as 5 minutes, targeting the coronavirus RDRP genes. It's a very simple and simple to handle. It's a compact machine which has a sample receiver, transfer cartridge, and a patient swab. Just collect the patient samples and mix it into the sample receiver. Transfer cartridge, put it into it, and within the 10 minutes, you will come to know the status of the patient, whether it is positive or the negative. This is a qualitative method. But some studies show there are variables may influence the test performance, including the specimen type, collection, transport, and the handling. Studies have shown the higher rate of invalid results on the ID Now, which is attributed to a certain steps in the protocol, recovering the users to forcefully push the sample transfer cartridge into the test case until the full distance of the test indicator. Negative results should prompt retesting on a different molecular platform due to the assess suboptimal sensitivity at the low viral burden. Thank you.
Okay, friends, we are fully masked now because we are all in the same room. So trying to social distances as best possible. So we're going to answer some of your questions. The first question is, is a buccal swab better than saliva? No, actually saliva is better than a buccal swab. Please elaborate at the end of CRISPR detection. The CRISPR detection method at the end is basically just a lateral flow. After the PCR is over, it's like a, it's like a band. You see it yes or no. It's basically an immunochromatographic test. This is an RNA virus. Then why is the third question is, why is the virus positive for such a long time? No, that's the issue. The patient remains positive for long because this is dead virus, and the dead virus is continuing to be present when the cells are desquamated as the patient is getting better. So these are not live viruses. So 6 weeks later, you may cough up something that may be PCR positive, but it's not live virus. Is there any comparative data between RT-PCR and antigen? Yes, there is. It is the RT-PCR is of course much better, where the antigen is about 50% and varies from 30 to about 55%. What should be the minimum duration between obtaining the samples of the same patient for RT-PCR? I didn't get that question, but means how often should we repeat it? Basically, the government doesn't, the guidelines of our country don't seem to, if you are positive and your symptoms subside 3 days after your symptoms subside, usually within the first 10 days, you don't have to repeat your RT-PCR. So when would you repeat your RT-PCR is basically for patients who need to be transferred out from the ICU, when you would repeat it at 15 days and thereafter. What should be the minimum? Yeah, that one. Then how to validate a new kit before releasing reports. Basically, you get your positive and negative samples from a reference lab and you guard them with your life. Then when you get a new kit, you would actually look at the CT values and look at how they would perform with the known positive and known negative controls that you've got. And then you validate it thereafter. Is there any relation between genetic variation of individual to be? Actually, currently we're only just about struggling with there is an association. No, there's no good scientific literature out there about the O blood group being particularly sort of less, more protective than A. But again, this is just being touted. Is TrueNAT better than RT-PCR? It all depends on what your priorities are. Depends. I mean, TrueNAT is doing a good job in centers who do not have the full RT-PCR setup, and we have to appreciate that. Is it necessary to fumigate the PCR room? To be honest, in our lab, we have a negative pressure lab. That is, once the negative pressure is on, we are not fumigating, and fumigating is possibly not what we do anymore. So we wipe down all our surfaces with hydrogen peroxide and silver nitrate, and after every assay. And we also put UV in our BSLs. Kanchan, there someone is asking you some examples about.
Okay, there is a question which says, what would you can you give some example scenario about inconclusive results in RT-PCR? So in the kit that we are using, if you have a single gene, what the kit says, it goes by the kit manufacturer's guidelines. So if it is mentioned that if any 2 genes are present, then it is detected. But if there is only 1 gene, you got to confirm that with another method. So you have to then do another another test to check that for reporting.
Okay. Then next is Abbott now doesn't seem to perform as good as the others. We haven't really started using it. We've seen a demonstration. Abbott now, there is a study out of New York which actually showed that Abbott missed 1/3 of the expert positive tests were actually missed by Abbott, but they clarified in the results section that the ones that were missed were all above a CT value of, I think, 35. So now you have your, I mean, we need to look at how Abbott performs in patients who are actually having symptoms in the acute phase and see how it does perform. But there is this one publication. Okay, Abbott, if we have a gene, is this, if we have a gene, there's a question. If we have an E gene, Kanchan or Sapna, you take this.
What is the question?
TrueNAT.
Yeah,
if we have a gene above target.
Read out the question.
Okay, if we have a E gene above target and ORF negative, it is reported as negative, but patient might turn positive later on. So should we advise repeat test? If yes, after how much time?
Above target. E gene above target is what do you mean by that?
I don't know what's the meaning of this question. It's I don't know how, because generally E gene is the first to come, and we don't usually see E gene coming later. E gene is pretty good to pick up. It picks up most of the coronaviruses as well. So that's been, I don't understand this
If the
question.
confirmatory is not there,
Yeah.
if the confirmatory is not there, then it could be some other coronavirus, not the SARS-CoV-2.
Can patients be taken up for surgery after 2 to 3 days without repeat test? Can patients be taken up for 2 to 3 days without repeat test? See, the whole thing depends. One, if the patient needs surgery and it's life-saving, you have to do it. You have to do it in full PPE, and there is no question of the PCR test being positive. And if you cannot say, oh, I was waiting for the COVID test. You have to look after a patient. It's our duty as doctors to operate on patients who need us for urgent. Patient has a ruptured appendix. You can't say the COVID test has not come. You have to do it, and the whole OT must be in full PPE. Second is that without PPE, without a repeat test. I didn't understand this question. Can somebody, Sangeeta, please, who's asked this question, can you just re-clarify it? After 2 to 3 days without repeat test. basically the other issue in when you look at surgery, if it is a surgery, say a cardiac bypass or a long neurosurgery case, where the anesthesia is going to be for 4 to 6 hours, there it's important to actually look at the HRCT, because if the HRCT is 4 rads 4-5, that means the lungs are badly affected. So you have to worry about how this patient would come off anesthesia as well if the lungs are badly affected. But again, weigh the risk versus benefit. Then we don't keep repeating our test 24 to 48 hours. The chances of reinfection, I think they're not common, but I was on a panel with Jayanti, and Dr. Jayanti Shastri, and she seemed to think that it's commoner than most. But the issues in reinfection is basically, you have to demonstrate, one, that the patient had an infection first. You have to keep that sample. You have to show that it is negative after a certain amount in time. And then when the patient gets another bout of symptoms and you show that it is positive, then you have to show that it's and the RT-PCR is positive. You have 2 samples which should be sequenced by whole genome sequencing, and then you would actually be able to prove that. Also, you need to show antibody testing, whether it's neutralizing antibodies that were not present after the first infection or it was just binding antibodies. Okay. Now, that's the next question is how to decide the threshold. Kanchan?
Okay, you can decide the threshold when you see that the amplification curve is just going into the exponential phase. So when the sigmoidal curve is starting to pick up, that's where you will decide the threshold.
Then for each and everything, you have to put the negative test. So for that, you have to put the negative extraction control. Depending upon the extraction control, only you can decide where your threshold is to be.
Yeah, that will negate the backdown.
Okay, then more questions. What could be the reason for an invalid RT-PCR internal control in some samples?
Okay. Okay, see, there could be many cases. Now, first of all, for that reason, what would be the internal control? If the internal control is RNSP gene, and if that has not come in the PCR, so somewhere down the line, it is not collected properly. There could be collection issues. But if you have a different external control as an internal control, like what we have in our kit is the MS2 Phage. So if that has not amplified, it does happen at times when the viral load is very high.
Okay. What is the status of saliva? Just read the question then.
What is the status of saliva or gargle samples in India instead of nasopharyngeal swabs for a real-time PCR test? The samples are validated for use in many countries, and some like Hong Kong, Japan, USA are also using it.
Basically, you can use saliva. We haven't had the guts to do that yet, but you need, whatever you do, you need to validate that it's working. I believe the CRISPR technology has been validated by CISR, and they have found that it can be used for saliva with a sensitivity of I think 80% for saliva and more than 90 for other samples. Okay. Then
what is the gene detected by N-CRISPR? Gene.
See the CRISPR. I mean, the Faluda testing, is it? Yeah, it's a R gene, but Faluda testings. I don't have any experience on CRISPR, but I believe it should be pretty good. And the LOD is how much? 140. The LOD is also low. If rapid antigen testing has high specificity, why ability to lose is less? No, it's like this. When you get a rapid antigen test positive, you don't repeat the PCR because it's a specific test. You only repeat the PCR when the rapid antigen test comes negative because it's got very poor sensitivity. Will CRISPR replace RT-PCR? Time will tell. I think it's a good technology and is going to give RT-PCR time for. Has the virus mutated? There have been reports of the D614G mutation seen from Thailand. and in India as well, that is supposed to be more transmissible. What CT value is to be considered as positive? Kanchan, you take this.
This is again going by the it differs from every kit to kit. So going by the manufacturer's guidelines as to if you are having a PCR of 40 cycles and what is the cutoff that the kit tells you. And then in general, when you start using the RT-PCR, every lab decides its own cutoff, that this is the cutoff that we have. Like if in our case, we use 37 as the cutoff, which is going by what the manufacturer says. Any relation?
Can CSF COVID PCR be done? Theoretically, yes, it can be done. Can we store
CT sample of H1N1 in VTM added with AVL buffer for more than 15 days?
How are you going to store it? All viruses have to be stored and not thawed frequently, which is why you aliquot it often. You store it at -70. Yeah, you can do it from the VTM. We are doing a biofire regularly when a patient is suspected of having, respiratory symptoms and is COVID negative and is clearly not COVID. We would do it from the same VTM, aliquoted VTM of another vial. Extracted RNA can be stored for how long? At -70, I mean, I know that pretty long. I mean, as 1, 2, 3, 4 years. I'm not sure the exact upper limit, but it can be stored for a lot of time. How do you dispose the VTM media that has been inoculated? Kanchan, take this.
Okay, you want to take it? So now I'll answer it. Oh, okay, the VTM, the media, it is disposed in 5% hypochlorite. And
Followed by autoclave.
Then how do you work with MTM? What is MTM? I don't know what is MTM. Acha, okay. No, we have not worked with MTM. No, it's not. So we're not in a position to know that. High CT content is.
Okay, yes, high CT is sometimes confusing how to decide by seeing the curve. Yeah, you got to, the high CT is definitely confusing. So you got to go into the multi-component and check for each of the target genes as to what is the curve looking like and how the various other parameters of the analysis need to be checked.
What is the validity of PCR reports for pre-operations? Shine, I didn't get this question. Basically, what is the validity of PCR report for pre-op cases? I mean, should we do it or should we not? It all depends on your institutional policies. You want to do it and keep your OT staff safe. The idea of pre-screening for pre-op is that one, for the patient, especially for major surgeries, if the patient is having or harboring COVID, there's a much more increase in fatality, almost 20%. So that's one of the reasons why you would want to screen. And the main important reason is you want to protect your staff. So, if the patient is COVID positive and the surgery can be deferred, you would defer it. Then what is if the pretest probability is low and we do surveillance before admitting for other reason, how good are Cepheid and Abbott in this situation? Okay, so basically this question means that if these are very sensitive tests, and if the pretest probability is low, the positive predictive value is going to give you the answer. It's not going to be that great, but this would apply possibly to screening tests. So here we possibly will have a higher, the positive predictive value will not be that great if we do it when patients are not symptomatic. What is the best disinfectant for COVID? Actually, COVID is not a terribly dangerous virus at all. It causes havoc with us, I know. But we're not changing any disinfectant more. We are wiping down our surfaces with 1% bleach. But otherwise, COVID is not a disinfectant resistant virus. We're using hydrogen peroxide in whatever we're using for our normal surfaces and our normal cleaning of our hospital. With vaccine, how long can one expect protection? That's $1 million question, Prabhakaran. I wish I knew. We're just hoping because that's all we have. They believe the estimate of protection should be about 60 to 70%. Again, that's a hope. You will have to double up on giving a second dose of vaccine within a month. And it all depends which vaccine you get. To be honest, I don't think we'll be in India, we'll be able to choose. It depends what is going to be available first. Possibly the Astra Oxford vaccine will come in first because it's got into phase 3. It's completing phase 3 in the UK. And it's, I think in India, we'll complete phase 3 by about early Jan. So hopefully that will be ready. I don't know how it's going to. I think, to be honest, we will be vaccinated, but we still will have to mask up when we are traveling, when we're expecting close, contact with people. I don't think we're going to drop our masks in a hurry. Yeah. Kanchan? How do you interpret?
How would you interpret E0 and N2 above 40 on the gene expert? Again, going by the manufacturer's guidelines, it says if N2 is there, it still says positive. So depending on what is the clinical scenario for this kind of a patient, if the patient is again a follow-up patient, you would know this is the long tail of the PCR which is coming out positive. But if it's a early pickup, it could be early on in the infection which is being picked up. So again, this needs to be even looked at clinically.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Kanchan, take that.
Yes, RBCs, yes, they are known to inhibit the PCR.
Because hemoglobin does. Beena Jose. Beena has 1 week before, so actually we've already exceeded the time. Maybe we can reply to this. Is it okay if we go on? Prashant?
Dr. Prashant.
Certainly. I mean, as long as it's not too many questions because questions are just flowing. So definitely, as long as you are possible to reply, please go ahead.
I have a meeting at 5:10, so I'll have to run off.
Yeah, certainly. I will definitely, honor that.
1 week before surgery, antigen was negative, PCR was done and turned out to be positive. Other than sample collection, is there any explanation? This is what we've been talking about. No? Antigen is not a sensitive test. And which is why you have to confirm all antigens, all our antigen negatives with the PCR. And that is the test to do. To be honest, an antigen test should be done for a patient who's symptomatic. We shouldn't waste the patient's time and energy and just, do an antigen that's going to be negative in an asymptomatic person who's going for surgery. Obviously, if he's going for surgery, he should be not having any symptoms of COVID, right? So it's poor sensitivity and good specificity. Okay. How often do you see repeat testing giving discrepant results? We do see it off and on, positive and negative. And I think it all depends in our follow-up patients. In our patients actually who are in our ICU and are quite fed up, they're wanting to go home or they're wanting to be discharged to our non-COVID hospital. We have 2 hospitals in Hinduja. One is a COVID and one is a non-COVID. So when from the COVID ICU, they want to go, they're not well enough to go home. And when we repeat the PCR, it comes negative, and then we repeat it again. When they reach the other ICU, it becomes positive. But then we kind of tell them that don't worry. If he's, if the patient is, usually these patients have been in ICU for about at least 20, 25 days. So we're not too fussed about them being infectious. But we do see it, yes. What about a high CT value? Can they come in early infections? Very, very early infection, yes, you can have a high CT, but that's a short blip as I showed you in that thing. But mostly they come in late infections. Do you report? No, we don't, because the ICMR has said there is no point in reporting our PCR with CT values, though our clinicians keep asking, and we actually only find merit in reporting the CT when a patient, like I said, is for follow-up. And we believe that, he's been there long enough. He's non-infectious. He's been in ICU 25 days and the CT is hovering around 36, 37. And we say, look, to be honest, he can go home. If he's fit enough to go home, he's not going to infect his family. Kanchan, you want to take this? What precautions can you take to cross over contamination while processing lab samples in the lab?
Batches. Okay. when you're processing the samples in batches, you got to take care that there is a minimal aerosol generation, and while pipetting, you need to use single tip for each samples and barrier tips, and even keep checking the labeling. Main essence is the label check at each step.
I think we'll have to wind up. It's almost 5:07. Prashant, is it okay? If there are any more questions, we'll reply to them on.
Certainly, ma'am. Certainly. I totally understand.
Answer like
We are
I-
already sending.
Yeah, I feel a bit like, what is that actor who does that rapid fire? What's his name?
Yeah. Certainly, ma'am. Certainly. So, yeah, certainly.
Karan Johar. Karan Johar. Sorry.
So
Yeah.
actually, it was a great question and answer session, and questions were just pouring in. And actually, I got a lot of learning and experience myself. So we are actually already past the.
I want to take this really important question by Shruti, which is when you're using when you're putting in hypo, you should not autoclave. Absolutely spot on. That's a very good question, and what we need to do is actually pour out the hypo before we autoclave, because it is true, it's toxic gases.
Yes.
Okay, fine. So I think the other questions maybe we could reply later, but I have to go for a meeting in 5:10.
Many
Thank you
thanks,
very
ma'am. We take this opportunity to sincerely thank you. And we also thank all the participants for engaging and, a very long and good Q&A session. I hope this session is going to help you all. Definitely. Dear participant, our next webinar will be next week on Friday. We will keep you posted, and that will be more on CBNet. So thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you all the participants. Thank you, Dr. Kanchan and Dr. Swapna, for all your time.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.